Iran figured out something that no country has pulled off in modern history. They turned a narrow stretch of water, 33 kilometers at its thinnest, into a toll booth. And not a cheap one. $2 million per ship. Cash, crypto, Chinese yuan, whichever you prefer. Just don't use dollars, because that's the one thing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps won't take. And for weeks, it worked. Ships were lining up, paying, and passing through one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's seaborne oil, every single day. Now think about what that means for a moment. Iran, a country under some of the heaviest sanctions in modern history, a country that just went through 40 days of US and Israeli airstrikes, was running what amounts to a maritime protection racket, and the world was paying. According to crypto analytics firm TRM Labs, Iran's military collected toll payments in Bitcoin, Chinese yuan, and potentially the stablecoin USDT, specifically to avoid the dollar-based financial system that US sanctions are built around. Iran's entire crypto ecosystem grew to $7.8 billion in 2025. And by the fourth quarter of that year, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps accounted for roughly half of it. That's not a coincidence. That's infrastructure. Here's what I think most people miss about this moment. When an Iranian parliament member named Aledin Bourajirdi went on state television on March 22nd and said, and I'm going to quote this carefully, Iran has the right to transfer $2 million from vessels wanting to transit the strait. This shows the power and the right that the Islamic Republic has. He wasn't just talking about money. He was announcing a new reality. The idea that international straits belong to everyone, that freedom of navigation is a right, not a privilege. That principle, which has governed maritime trade for decades, was being challenged out loud, on television, by a government that had just closed the most important shipping lane on Earth. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Iran wasn't charging everyone equally. This wasn't a universal toll. It was selective. Ships from countries Iran considered friendly, China, Russia, India, Iraq, Pakistan, were allowed to negotiate passage. Ships linked to the US, Israel, or their allies, blocked. So Iran effectively created a two-tier system inside an international waterway. Your access depended entirely on your government's relationship with Tehran. Lloyd's List intelligence tracked what happened to traffic. From March 1 to March 25th, commercial vessels made just 142 crossings through the Strait of Hormuz. In the same period in 2025, there were 2,652. That's a 94.6% collapse in shipping traffic. Before the conflict, roughly 110 ships passed through every single day, carrying 21 million barrels of oil. The entire month of March's traffic equaled roughly one normal day, and oil markets felt every bit of it. Prices shot above $100 a barrel. The global economy started to bend. Now here's where Trump enters the picture. On April 7th, the US and Iran announced a fragile two-week ceasefire, and almost immediately Trump floated something unexpected. He suggested the US might set up its own toll system on the strait, or even a joint venture with Iran to share the revenue. He told ABC News it would be a way of securing it, also securing it from lots of other people. Think about what that means. The United States was, even briefly, entertaining the idea of doing exactly what it was condemning Iran for doing, charging ships for passage through an international waterway. That idea didn't go anywhere, at least not publicly. But what followed showed just how fragile the ceasefire really was. J.D. Vance flew to Islamabad, 21 hours of negotiations, US and Iranian delegations, face-to-face, with Pakistani officials in the room. By multiple accounts, including Iran's own foreign minister Abbas Araghchi, they were close. He described it as being inches away from a memorandum of understanding. And then it fell apart. The US side, according to Iranian officials, kept moving the terms, what Araghchi called maximalism and shifting goalposts. The core sticking points, Iran's nuclear enrichment program, and who controls the Strait of Hormuz going forward. Vance boarded his plane, and within hours, Trump posted on Truth Social. Effective immediately, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. He called Iran's toll system world extortion. He said the US would interdict every vessel that had already paid Iran a toll. He announced the Navy would begin destroying mines that Iran had laid throughout the strait. US Central Command confirmed the blockade would begin Monday, April 14th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. More than a dozen warships, over 100 aircraft, more than 10,000 US military personnel. The Strait of Hormuz, the toll booth, was shut down. But here's the question that nobody is asking clearly enough. When you shut down a toll booth that was already barely functioning, in a waterway that was already carrying a fraction of its normal traffic, what exactly are you shutting down? And who does that actually hurt? That's what we're going to walk through in this video. Because the blockade isn't just a military move. It's a statement about who gets to control the rules of global trade. And the answer to that question has consequences that go far beyond the Persian Gulf. If you think this story matters, drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if you want more analysis like this, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. Here is the part of this story that almost nobody is covering clearly. When Trump announced the blockade and called Iran's toll system world extortion, he was not wrong about the extortion part. What Iran was doing was, by most legal interpretations, a direct violation of international maritime law. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, coastal states cannot charge tolls for transit through international straits. The right of passage is supposed to be free, unconditional, non-suspendable. Iran's argument is that it never ratified that convention. It signed it in 1982 and walked away. So technically, Tehran says it isn't bound. Legal scholars push back hard on that. They argue the core principles of transit passage have become customary international law, meaning they apply to everyone, whether you sign the document or not. But here's what matters more than the legal debate. A country was charging $2 million per ship to pass through a waterway that carries 20% of the world's seaborne oil, and the world was paying. That tells you something about where real power sits when a choke point closes. Now let's talk about who is actually getting hurt by all of this, because this is where the story gets complicated in ways that don't fit neatly into the America versus Iran frame that most coverage is using. Start with Iraq. Iraq is a country of 40 million people. It is not a party to this war. It did not bomb Iran. It did not launch missiles at anyone. And yet, according to economic analysis cited widely in coverage of the conflict, 90% of Iraq's government revenue comes from oil exports, and nearly all of that oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, 90% of Iraq's food and medicine imports also come through that same corridor. Think about what that means. Iraq is simultaneously trying to sell its oil out through Hormuz and buy its groceries back through Hormuz. Both directions, both blocked or disrupted. Iraq's oil field in Zubair, near Basra, was producing around 400,000 barrels per day before the conflict. Output dropped to roughly 250,000 as a result of the disruption. That is not a rounding error for Iraq's economy. That is a fiscal emergency. And Iraq is not alone. The Gulf Cooperation Council, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, imports around 70% of its food through the Strait of Hormuz. By mid-March, roughly 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted. Retailers in some countries began airlifting basic staples. Consumer prices spiked 40 to 120% in some categories. That is not a statistic. That is families paying double for bread. Then there is Europe. The conflict hit Europe at the worst possible moment. European gas storage levels were estimated at just 30% capacity going into spring 2026, after a harsh winter drew reserves down. Qatar, one of Europe's key LNG suppliers, declared force majeure on exports after Hormuz closed. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks, the European gas price index, nearly doubled to over 60 euros per megawatt hour by mid-March. The European Central Bank postponed planned interest rate cuts. It raised its inflation forecast. Economists began warning that Germany and Italy face real risks of a technical recession if the maritime disruption lasts through the summer. UK inflation is expected to breach 5% in 2026. Britain's IEA analysis found that Europe had replaced just over half of the jet fuel supply it lost from the Middle East disruption. Not all of it. Half. And here's what I think is the most underreported fact in this entire story. Oil prices posted their largest ever monthly gain in March 2026, according to the International Energy Agency, in the wake of the most severe oil supply shock in history. The most severe oil supply shock in history. Not one of the worst. The worst. And it is still unfolding. As of this week, Brent crude is trading around $95 per barrel. That is down from its peak above $120, because markets are pricing in the hope of new talks. But it is still nearly double what it was before February 28th, when this conflict began. At the pump in America, the average price for a gallon of regular gasoline stood at $4.11 as of mid-April, up from $2.98 on the day the US and Israel launched operations against Iran. That is a 38% increase at the pump for American drivers, in less than 7 weeks. The IMF has now weighed in. Its April 2026 World Economic Outlook, titled bluntly, Global Economy in the Shadow of War, cut the global growth forecast to 3.1% for 2026, down from 3.4% last year. The fund raised its global inflation projection to 4.4%, up 0.6 points from January, and it laid out three scenarios. In the best case, conflict ends soon, global output grows at 2.6%. In the middle scenario, war lingers, impact fades by 2027, growth falls to 2.5%, inflation jumps 1.5 points. In the worst case, and I want to quote this carefully, global growth would be reduced by 1.3 percentage points in 2026. This would mean a close call for a global recession, which has happened only 4 times since 1980. The last 2 times were the global financial crisis and COVID-19. That is the context in which Trump's blockade is happening. Not against a strong global economy that can absorb a shock, against an economy that was already weakened, already dealing with inflation that never fully came down, already watching energy prices climb for 45 days before the blockade even started. In my view, this is the part of the story that gets lost in the daily drama of ships and statements. The blockade is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening inside a system that is already stressed. And when you add pressure to a stressed system, the outcomes are harder to predict and harder to reverse. What does this mean for ordinary people? It means higher gas prices, not just in America, but in Nigeria, Vietnam, Pakistan, countries that were already facing fuel shortages in March and are now dealing with a complete halt on Iranian port traffic. It means food prices in the Gulf that were already elevated are going to stay elevated. It means European factories facing 30% energy surcharges are going to think harder about layoffs before summer. And it means 20,000 sailors, confirmed by the International Maritime Organization, are still sitting on ships inside the Persian Gulf, unable to leave, waiting for someone to resolve this. The blockade did not rescue them. It made their situation more uncertain. None of this means the blockade is wrong. That is a political judgment, and that's not what this channel does. What I can say is this: the costs of this standoff are real. They are already being paid, and they are being paid mostly by people who had no vote in any of the decisions that created this situation. That is worth understanding. Before we move on to ask what happens next, let's talk about the 2 countries that nobody in Washington seems to have fully accounted for when the blockade decision was made: China and India. Because this is where the Hormuz story stops being just a US-Iran confrontation and starts being something much larger. Start with China. China bought more than 80% of Iran's exported oil last year. According to data from Kepler, that was 1.4 million barrels per day, out of China's total seaborne crude imports of 10.4 million barrels. China also gets more than half of all its oil from the broader Middle East. So when Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz in early March, China didn't just lose a geopolitical partner's exports. China lost access to a significant portion of the energy that runs its entire manufacturing economy. China is the world's largest manufacturer. It produces more physical goods than any other country on Earth. Those factories run on energy. That energy largely comes through a 33-kilometer gap between Iran and Oman. Now here's where it gets interesting. During the weeks Iran controlled the strait, China was on the list of countries allowed to negotiate passage. Iran specifically named China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan as nations whose vessels could transit, after coordination with the IRGC and payment. Bloomberg reported that Iran was even offering Pakistani-flagged vessels as a workaround, approaching commodity traders to see if their ships could temporarily sail under Pakistani flags to get through. The system was improvised, chaotic, and deeply political, but it worked just enough to keep some Chinese cargo moving. Then Trump announced the blockade, and the key phrase in his statement was critical. He said the US Navy would interdict every vessel in international waters that has paid a toll to Iran. Not just Iranian ships, every vessel. That includes Chinese-owned tankers that had been navigating Iran's tollbooth system to move oil and goods. And within 24 hours of the blockade starting, a US-sanctioned Chinese tanker called the Rich Starry sailed out through the Strait of Hormuz anyway. The Rich Starry is owned by Shanghai Xuanrun Shipping. It carries a Chinese crew. It was sanctioned by the US Treasury for dealings with Iran, and it moved. According to maritime data from LSEG and Kepler, it appears to have been the first vessel to exit the Gulf after the blockade began. Now, the US has said vessels not heading to Iranian ports can still transit. The Rich Starry's last port of call was Hamria in the UAE, not an Iranian port. So technically, under CENTCOM's own rules, it may not have been blockade violating. But that is exactly the kind of ambiguity that creates dangerous moments at sea. Because the other sanctioned tanker that passed through, the Elpis, departed directly from the Iranian port of Bushehr. It had been anchored in Iranian waters for nearly 2 weeks, and it crossed anyway. So within the first day of the blockade, you had sanctioned Chinese-linked vessels moving through the strait, some from Iranian ports, and the US military apparently not stopping them. China's foreign ministry called the blockade, and I'm quoting their spokesperson Guo Jiakun, dangerous and irresponsible behavior that would further jeopardize safety of passage. Then China hardened its tone further on Tuesday. Beijing warned that the blockade will only aggravate confrontation, escalate tension, and undermine the already fragile ceasefire. And then came the intelligence report that changed the temperature of this entire situation. U.S. intelligence, reported by CNN and confirmed to other outlets, indicated that China is planning to provide new air defense weaponry to Iran in the coming weeks. Trump responded publicly. If China does that, he said, China is going to have big problems. China's embassy flatly denied it. China has never provided weapons to any party to the conflict, a spokesperson said. But the fact that this is being discussed publicly, that U.S. intelligence is leaking it, that Trump is making direct threats, tells you something about how quickly this situation is expanding beyond its original frame. And then there's India. India's situation is different from China's, but equally complicated. Earlier in April, India had resumed purchases of Iranian oil and gas, after a 7-year pause, having secured safe passage from Tehran and a temporary U.S. waiver on sanctions. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi called Trump for a nearly 40-minute conversation on Tuesday. He said publicly they had a useful exchange of views on the Middle East and that India supports de-escalation and restoration of peace. That is the language of a country trying very carefully to stay on good terms with Washington while not blowing up an energy relationship that its economy depends on. Teneo's South Asia geopolitical risk advisor Arpit Chaturvedi put it plainly. If the blockade holds, India will almost certainly halt crude imports from Iran. The alternative, risking its relationship with Washington, is not a trade-off New Delhi is willing to make right now. But here's what this means at the system level. The U.S. blockade is not just pressuring Iran. It is reshaping energy relationships across the entire Asian continent. China is the largest buyer of Iranian oil, blockaded from its primary supplier. India just resumed buying Iranian oil, now facing pressure to stop again. Both countries are watching Washington demonstrate that it can use its naval dominance to cut off the energy supply of any country doing business with a U.S. adversary. That lesson is not lost on Beijing. It is not lost on New Delhi, and it is certainly not lost on Moscow. In my view, what we are watching is not just a tactical move to pressure Iran. It is a demonstration of something much larger, that the United States is willing to use its position as the world's dominant naval power to enforce economic isolation on a scale that affects countries well beyond the target. Whether that demonstration achieves its intended goal is a separate question. But the fact that a second U.S.-sanctioned Chinese tanker passed through the strait on the first day of the blockade, while China called the move dangerous and irresponsible, and while U.S. intelligence was leaking reports of possible Chinese weapons deliveries to Iran, tells you that the situation on the water and the situation in diplomacy are moving in very different directions simultaneously. And that gap between what is happening at sea and what is being said in press briefings is exactly where dangerous miscalculations tend to happen. So where does this actually go? Because right now, as of April 15th, 2026, the situation looks like this. Iran ran a $2 million per ship toll booth on the most important waterway in the world. Trump shut it down with a naval blockade. China called it dangerous and irresponsible. Britain said it won't join. France and Britain are organizing their own peaceful multinational mission to restore freedom of navigation. And behind closed doors, both Washington and Tehran are signaling they want to talk again. Trump told the New York Post on Tuesday that new talks could be happening over the next 2 days. He called back 30 minutes after his first interview to say that. Iran's foreign minister, speaking after Islamabad collapsed, described the two sides as inches away. Vance said Iranian negotiators moved in our direction but didn't move far enough. A second round of talks is being discussed. Pakistan has offered to host again. Geneva is also being considered. The ceasefire expires on April 21st. That is 6 days from now. So the real question is not whether Trump was right to call Iran's toll system extortion. By most accounts, it was. The real question is, what does success actually look like here? And is the blockade the tool that gets you there? Let me walk through what each side wants, because I think this is where a lot of the coverage goes fuzzy. The United States has 3 core demands. First, Iran must give up its nuclear enrichment program. Vance was explicit. We must have the enriched material out of Iran. Not paused. Out. Second, Iran must reopen the Strait of Hormuz unconditionally. No tolls, no IRGC escorts, no selective passage. Third, Iran must stop supporting armed groups across the region, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others. Iran's position is almost a mirror image, but in reverse. Tehran wants the war to end completely, including Israel's operations in Lebanon. It wants sanctions lifted. It wants its frozen assets released. It wants to maintain some form of control over the strait, and it has said repeatedly that it will not dismantle its nuclear program under what it calls surrender terms. Iranian Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf said publicly that Iran would not extend the ceasefire unless Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz was part of the deal. That is not a minor sticking point. That is the central sticking point. Because the strait is the only real leverage Iran has left. Think about what Iran has lost since February 28th. Its supreme leader, killed. Its air defenses, largely destroyed. Its missile production facilities, heavily damaged. Its economy, contracting 6.1% in 2026, according to the IMF's projection. And yet, Iran still has the strait. It laid mines in the water. Some of those mines, reportedly, Iran itself has now lost track of, meaning even Iran may not be able to fully reopen the passage, even if it wanted to. That detail is not a small footnote. It means the waterway that controls 20% of global oil has an unknown number of untracked mines in it. The U.S. Navy has begun mine clearance operations. CENTCOM says it is deploying more than a dozen warships, over 100 aircraft, and more than 10,000 personnel for blockade enforcement. This is a large, expensive, and complex military operation being conducted simultaneously with diplomatic negotiations that could resume within days. History suggests these two tracks, military pressure and direct talks, can coexist. But they create instability. One incident at sea, one ship stopped in a way that escalates, one drone launched in error, and the ceasefire that is already fragile becomes something else. Iran's armed forces have already called the blockade piracy and threatened ports across the Gulf if its own ports are hit. The IRGC said any military vessel approaching the strait would be considered a ceasefire violation and would meet a severe response. So far, the ceasefire has held. Barely. Now let me tell you the thing I think is most important to understand about this moment. The blockade and the toll booth are both symptoms of the same underlying problem. The Strait of Hormuz has no agreed governance structure that both major powers, the US and Iran, accept. Iran rejects UNCLOS. The US hasn't ratified it either. There is no binding international framework that both sides have agreed to for how this waterway gets managed. What that means is that every time a crisis hits Hormuz, and there have been many going back decades, it gets resolved through raw power, not through law. The country with the most ships, the most missiles, the most leverage at that moment, wins. For decades, that was unambiguously the United States. The US Navy kept the strait open through sheer presence. What changed in 2026 is that Iran demonstrated it could shut that presence down temporarily, not by defeating the US military, but by making the strait too dangerous and too contested for normal commercial operation. And then by charging for access. That is a new dynamic, and it doesn't go away when this particular crisis ends. Because Iran has now shown that geography, mines, and willingness to absorb punishment can create leverage against a naval superpower, that lesson is filed away. It's filed away in Beijing, which has its own Taiwan Strait concerns. It's filed away in Moscow. It's filed away in every country watching how this plays out. So the real stakes of the Hormuz standoff in 2026 are not just whether Iran reopens the strait or whether Trump gets a deal. The real stakes are whether the rules that govern the world's most critical shipping lanes get rewritten, or whether they get reinforced. And right now, with Britain organizing one coalition, France joining it, China calling the blockade irresponsible, Iran calling it piracy, and the US calling Iran's tolls extortion, everyone is using the language of rules while doing whatever their power allows. That is not a stable situation. But it is, in my view, the most important story in the global economy right now. Not because it will definitely end badly. It may not. New talks could produce a deal this week. The ceasefire could be extended. Oil could fall back toward $80. Ships could start moving again. But because the structural question underneath it, who controls the choke points of global trade, and by what rules, is not going away with any ceasefire. It is the question that will define the next decade of geopolitics. And it is being answered right now, ship by ship, in a corridor 33 kilometers wide. If this analysis made you think differently about what's happening in the world, drop a comment below. I genuinely want to know what you think about this. This story is moving fast, and your perspective matters.